I've been letting go of things that I've been doing for a long time around this story of consistency and, oh, I'm so disciplined and I'm showing up every day. And for me, that's not as much of a driving factor anymore. It's really more about authenticity and impact that keeps me engaged in the project. So on one hand, it looks like, yeah, I'm quitting my podcast after 5 years, but what's actually happening is 5 years ago, I started this podcast from an Airbnb in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia. It was the middle of the pandemic. I had no studio, no team, no recording devices, just a deep curiosity and a calling to tell the untold stories of the people behind movements for social good. And back then, spotlighting purpose-driven people felt rare. It felt needed. And I nominated myself to fill that void. But a lot has changed since then. And this week, I am excited to announce that I am pulling back the curtain on the future of this podcast. And it's a decision that I didn't think I'd be making at this moment in time. If you've ever wrestled with letting go of something that once lit you up, then this episode is for you. This is going to be a solo episode, and I'm going to talk about how to know when something meaningful has run its course, why alignment matters more than consistency, and we're going to talk about the evolution of this project and what I'm choosing to focus on now that this podcast is going to be coming to an end. And I'll put timestamps below if you would like to skip around. We are back with a solo episode. It's Light Watkins. And I've got some major news for you guys today. This month is the 5th year anniversary of this podcast. I'll never forget back in June of 2020, I was staying in Atlanta. Obviously, the pandemic was only a few months in, and I had been nomadic for a few years at that point since 2018. So I didn't really have a chair to go back to when the music stopped playing, so to speak. So my family lived in Atlanta, and I decided to go to Atlanta and spend some time there. Obviously, nobody knew how long the pandemic was going to last. So I just got an Airbnb in Midtown Atlanta and just kind of on a month-to-month basis. And I'd been recording episodes of my podcast several months prior to that. And I decided to call it At the End of the Tunnel. And I remember just being so excited about having conversations and getting guests. And the thing that inspired me to start the podcast in the first place, I was a big fan of Guy Raz's How You Built This podcast, where he would talk to entrepreneurs and business leaders, founders, about how they started whatever their big brand that they became known for, how they started those companies. And I thought to myself, wow, I would love to do the same thing for people who've started movements for social good, people who've made the world a better place. I feel like nobody really talks about those processes. They talk about the highlight reel, but they don't really talk about all of the nuanced things that happen leading up to the creation of a movement. And I had been hosting these nonprofit inspirational variety shows for several years before that when I was living in Los Angeles, and we were bringing people to come and give talks, people who'd started movements for social good, because that's what that movement was. Those variety shows, that was a movement for social good. So I had been super curious and inspired about that for many years. And in the podcast space, I didn't really recognize many other podcasts that were focusing on that, on the personal stories behind the brands or behind the thing. So I felt like there was a hole in the market, and I wanted to fill that hole. And I wanted my signature to be doing really in-depth research, which I did. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. So anyway, 5 years, almost 300 episodes later, we're now at the end of the line for that show. And one of the reasons why I am now going to pivot away from my podcast, which is called The Light Watkins Show, We rebranded it a few years ago, is because I feel like there are so many podcasts right now that are going deeper into the personal story. I don't have to be the one that's actually doing that. In fact, one of my favorite podcasts is Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast. I feel like he does a really good job of asking those kinds of questions that I like to ask. And now that I know that his show is out there and a bunch of other shows are out there having these conversations with these kinds of people, then I feel like I don't really have to keep doing it in the way that I was doing it before. And also, I don't feel like what I'm contributing now to the podcast space is as unique as it was 5 years ago when I originally started. And this is just me looking at my contribution in a very objective way. Granted, I think I'm a pretty cool host and I ask pretty cool questions and I get pretty cool people on my show. But at the end of the day, the podcast landscape has changed so much over the years. I mean, when I started, because there was the pandemic, most interviews were happening virtually over Zoom. And nowadays, in order to really break out as a podcast, you kind of need to have an in-person studio. And you kind of need to be located in a market where a lot of other in-person studio podcasts are located, such as Los Angeles, primarily Austin, London, places like that. And as you all know, I've been here in Mexico City for several years. While I do have an in-person studio option that I can access if I happen to have some big guests in town, Mexico City is not exactly on that circuit. And so it's a little bit less reliable and less predictable when it comes to getting those bigger guests. So my show has kind of been stuck in that mid-tier range for a while, which means that it's been more of a passion project, if I'm being honest, right? I loved doing it. I love having these conversations, and I like the idea of offering value to people who I meet, who I find interesting. And at the same time, I feel like I'm just another podcast that is on the virtual podcast circuit that people go on. And by the time they get to my podcast, probably they've been on 10, 20 other podcasts, which means they've told the same stories 10 or 20 other times. And they're pretty much there to pitch something. It could be a book, it could be a documentary or something like that. And I just don't feel like that's the contribution that I want to continue making in this space. And so at the beginning of the year, I started a new series called The Spiritual Perspective, which is something that I have been very passionate about. And I have that same feeling that I originally had 5 years ago when I first started At the End of the Tunnel, which became the Watkins show, where I was just really interested and curious around offering my perspective on various topical issues such as politics, relationships, conflict, right? Basically whatever's happening in the news, and offering what I call the spiritual perspective on those things, which is something I often think about, right? Just in my day-to-day life, in my work, in my writing. For those of you who've read any of my books, you know that I am very passionate about writing from that spiritual perspective, which is that sort of broader perspective as compared to what I call the ground level perspective, which is the more binary, linear perspective of what happened and sequential order. Well, the spiritual perspective is really more of a, what does this mean for us type of perspective. And so I've been releasing weekly spiritual perspective episodes. They're like 10 minutes. Some of them are as short as around 8 minutes. Some of them are 20, 21 minutes. But it's where I take a topic out of the news or something that I think a lot of people in our modern age are dealing with or navigating, and I offer that spiritual perspective on that topic. And so I haven't seen anybody doing this in the podcast space. And I think this is an opportunity for me to make a unique contribution in that space in a way that People may not necessarily always agree with that perspective, but it just gives them food for thought. It gives them something to contrast whatever they're experiencing against. And that's really exciting to me. And I also have decided that I can still do the occasional interview. I'll call them spiritual perspective conversations. So in the event that I do meet somebody who I would like to have that long form conversation with, then I can still invite them on to my podcast and we can still have a conversation. And I can pick their brain around their understanding of the spiritual perspective in whatever area of life or business or whatever they excel in. And I think that could be kind of interesting too. For me, it's just a really beautiful way to niche down on all the things that I'm doing. And I've kind of been in a phase in my life where I've been letting go of things that I may have been doing for a long time around this sort of story of consistency and, oh, I'm so disciplined and I have so much, I'm showing up every day. And for me, that's not as much of a driving factor anymore. For me, it's really more about authenticity and impact, right? Am I able to express myself authentically? And am I having the amount of impact, both in the external world as well as within myself, that keeps me engaged in the project? So on one hand, it looks like, I'm quitting my podcast after 5 years. But from a spiritual perspective, what's actually happening is I'm graduating from that particular expression of podcasting to going all in on this other expression of podcasting, because the spiritual perspective is still a podcast, but it's more of a talking head format instead of an interview format. And in fact, instead of just having a weekly episode, I'm going to go to twice a week. So right now, I'm doing a spiritual perspective on Monday, and I've been doing a long form conversation on Thursdays. So now I'm going to replace the long form conversation starting next week with a second spiritual perspective for the week. And many of the spiritual perspectives are going to be like opinion pieces where I'm just going to be giving commentary. And then a large portion of them are going to be instructional, right? So things like the 5 things you need to do to get your meditation practice off the ground, or the 3 considerations you want to make whenever you're starting a gratitude practice, and things like that. Things that are just a little bit more basic, practical, how-to format. And the other ones may be how to move on from a breakup, or the spiritual perspective on conflict in the world, how to think about things like what's happening in the Middle East right now, and other sort of hot button topics. I find that really interesting to weigh in on those kinds of topics from the spiritual perspective. And then again, doing the occasional interview, the occasional spiritual perspective conversation. So that's really exciting to me. And this is something that I want to also model for you all, the listener, because I know what it feels like when you're trying to build something and you get to a point where you're just not sure if it's still aligned in the way that you feel like it needs to be in order for you to continue investing the time and energy and resources into it. And the way I like to look at those kinds of situations is the option is never really to stop and just do nothing. I think it's really about finding the path forward that does feel aligned, right? And so you have your version of maybe doing a podcast and then deciding, okay, the way I've been doing this no longer really resonates with where I am right now in this season of my life. And instead of thinking of quitting or thinking of, not doing anything, asking yourself, okay, well, what path does feel aligned? And if you look at my example, right, I started the spiritual perspective 6 months ago. So I've been doing both at the same time. And the spiritual perspective videos are the ones that I get really excited about on a weekly basis. Like, for instance, I'm recording this right now at 10 o'clock at night on a Monday night, right? And I'm excited about doing that. I don't see this as a hassle. I'm not like tired. No, I can't wait to go to sleep. None of that. I actually want to record this. I'm looking forward to it. I bought all these lights and reupholstered my furniture and painted my walls and all of these things because I'm really engaged in putting my best foot forward with these spiritual perspective videos and using it to continue growing my YouTube channel so that we get more eyeballs on this content so that I can help more people. And that's another thing that is different with this versus the long form conversations. With the long form conversations, obviously I do my research and I have bullet points around how I imagine the story is going to go, but you never really know what the guest is going to talk about. And so you have a little bit less control over the narratives. 9 times out of 10, it'll go in the way that I researched it. But every now and again, it kind of goes in a different direction, and it's all fine. But I like the idea of creating a narrative that I have say in from beginning to end. I really like that because, again, it gets to be completely me, right? I don't have to try to recover a conversation that I feel like is going in a different direction to the one that I ultimately thought was most valuable for you guys, for the viewer and for the listener. And so with the spiritual perspective, I get to kind of think about the whole thing and create the storyline. And hey, maybe it really resonates, maybe it falls flat, but in any case, I'm always learning. And I find that process to be very exciting. Hey, if you've been knocking your head against the wall when it comes to daily meditation, falling off the wagon, getting back on, not quite sure if what you're doing is working, don't worry, I got you. For a limited time, I'm giving away my signature 7-day meditation kickstart for free to you, my podcast listeners. Plus, you'll get a free 2-week all-access pass to my entire Happiness Insiders online curriculum of challenges and masterclasses, which will provide you with a crystal clear roadmap for mastering your inner work. You'll also get support directly from me and accountability and a place to ask questions. And you can join me live for a meditation on each of your 2 free weeks. So with zero cost to you, you can get a daily meditation practice that you'll actually enjoy and look forward to doing for the rest of your life. And you'll have me to personally support you and hold you accountable. And after your 7-day meditation kickstart ends, you can start the 108-day meditation challenge and get even more support. And you can take as many other inner work challenges and masterclasses as you can fit into those 2 weeks. We have an unheard of 80% completion rate for our challenges, which is over 20 times higher than your average online course. So if you've been feeling stuck and inconsistent when it comes to your inner work practices, you will not find a better solution anywhere online. Go to thehappinessinsiders.com and let's get your meditation practice up and running today. That's thehappinessinsiders.com, and you can tell that nagging daily stress to kiss your ass. I'll put a link below in the description. And so I've done enough of the preliminary research 6 months in, that's a good 20 something episodes to know that, okay, this is where it is right now. This is what continues feeling aligned. And when I think about it, it makes me feel expansive and I get excited about it and excited about creating the YouTube thumbnails for them and thinking about the titles and, just every single aspect of it. Whereas with the long form conversations, I found my enthusiasm falling a bit flat, if I'm being honest. And it felt like I was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, which is interesting. It's interesting how something that initially lit you up for several years can evolve to that place where it just feels like this is not really feeling aligned for me anymore. But hey, it's happened with other things. I had my daily dose of inspiration email that I had been doing for, I think, 8 years every day, not missing a day. And I decided at the end of last year, at the end of 2024, that it was time to retire that. And then I transitioned into the Spiritual Perspective newsletter, which goes out once a week, but now it's going to be going out a couple of times a week. So the way I know that it was time, honestly, is that I have not missed the daily dose of inspiration one day since I stopped doing it. I literally don't think about it anymore. If anything, I feel complete in that contribution. And so that's how I know that it was beyond time to retire it or to graduate from it and to move on to something else. And so I feel the same way about the podcast. We have published most of the episodes that have already been recorded, and I feel complete. I feel very, very complete with it. I feel like I've made a significant contribution to those conversations, and they still will exist. In fact, we're going to go back and just repackage some of them, meaning put a new thumbnail on those most popular conversations so you can still access them. And on this particular podcast channel, we're going to include some spiritual perspective episodes just to whet your appetite for this new format. And I hope that you give it a chance and you stay engaged and you continue to contribute your voice in the form of comments, in the form of shares, in the form of likes, and any other way that you want to help me spread the word in making this pivot and this contribution. Also, if there are any topics that you would like to see me weigh in on, I think people assume that I'm getting like hundreds, maybe thousands of messages, all the time. That's actually not happening. I may get a dozen messages in a week. So if you were to email me your suggestions, hey, Light, I'd love to hear you talk about this aspect of relationship, or I'd love to hear you talk about this thing that's happening around the world. I will see your message. I pretty much see everything that comes in. I don't always get a chance to respond to everything, but I definitely see everything. So feel free to email me, light@lightwatkins.com, if you want me to address a certain topic and offer the spiritual perspective on that particular topic. And otherwise, thank you so much for your listenership and for your viewership. I'm really trying to put a lot of emphasis on the YouTube channel. So if you want that next dimension of the story, I highly recommend you checking it out on YouTube. You just go to YouTube and just type in Light Watkins or type in the spiritual perspective, and you should see the whole playlist. And the thumbnails are all purple. So pretty much once you see the page with all the purple stuff, purple thumbnails, then that'll let you know that you're on the right page. And you can just go through the whole playlist or just go through whichever topics resonate with you. But there's a lot there so far. We've got a lot about relationships. We've got a lot about politics. We've got a lot about pop culture. And if you watch just, a handful of them, you'll get a pretty good sense for the spiritual perspective. And the idea is to help you start to apply that spiritual perspective in your own life. And the whole goal of applying the spiritual perspective is definitely not to sound smart or not to sound like you are more spiritual than somebody else. The whole goal of applying the spiritual perspective is really to be present. And present means the absence of worry and regret. So the more present you are, the more on purpose you tend to be. And the more on purpose you are, the more you start to see opportunities for giving, for being of service. And the more you take advantage of those opportunities, the more fulfilled you tend to be in life. So the whole idea, if we extrapolate it, is to increase our level of fulfillment. That's why I'm publishing these episodes, is to give you a perspective that you can apply to whatever you're going through in your life, because there are certain principles that get repeated again and again in each episode. And it's just a repetition thing. The more you hear these principles over and over, the quicker the recall is going to be when you start to encounter your own challenges, and you're going to be able to say, oh, that's right. That's the way. This is the spiritual perspective on this situation that I'm going through. And obviously it works in tandem with your inner work. So it's not just about intellectualizing this stuff, but I do talk a lot about embodiment and integration and using it with your inner practices. Obviously, meditation is one of the foundational practices. Gratitude is a big practice, right? Journaling is a big practice. Going out into nature is a big practice. Going for walks, just little things that anybody can do on any given day. Those are all still highly encouraged. And I want to just keep putting out different angles of life scenarios and challenges that people tend to face so that you can more and more easily find the language for the spiritual perspective in the different things that you're experiencing in your life. So overall, I'm very excited about this new direction and all of the comments and supports that you all have left so far on the spiritual perspective channel. We may have a little bit of bumpiness as we start to make it twice a week, but I'm going to commit to every Monday and every Thursday and be as consistent as I can be. And, these things, again, they evolve over time. I remember when I first started the podcast in 2020, I had a very strict format, just talking about childhood and then going into the journey to starting the movement, et cetera. And then over the years, then that narrative sort of opened up a little bit more. And I think I became a better interviewer, and I was just kind of more in the moment and not really focused on, hitting those plot points as rigidly as I was in the early days. And I'm sure the same thing is going to happen with the spiritual perspective, where I have my format now, and then just through sheer repetition and getting your feedback, definitely I'm going to evolve that. And I don't know how it's going to look as I evolve it, but I do know that it's going to be evolved. Right now, they're very scripted. Like, I sit down and I literally write out the whole thing from beginning to end. Maybe it'll evolve towards being more of bullet points. Maybe it'll evolve to just being off the top of my head. Kind of like, this is a solo episode that I have some bullet points, but mostly it's just kind of off the top of my head. So yeah, we got to start somewhere. And I guess if you're looking at this as an example again for your life, the main takeaway is just to start and to give yourself a deadline and to be consistent and commit to that deadline. I call it the feed the baby strategy, where if you have a baby, if you have a child, then you know that a lot of times children either aren't aware or don't care that you are not in the mood to have to provide for them, or maybe you're even sick, you have a headache, whatever, but the baby still needs to be fed, which means that regardless of whatever you have going on in your own world, you still have to arrange for the protection and the provision of your offspring. And that may require you to think, many days ahead. It may require you to take time off from other things that you may have wanted to do, or whatever you need to do to arrange to have that child be fed and be protected and be clothed and all the other things. And we want to treat our purpose-centric projects in the same way. If you have something that feels aligned with your soul, a lot of times what we tend to do is we tend to treat it like an extracurricular activity, which means I'll get to it on the weekends or when I have some free time. Instead, I highly recommend, treating it like your job. This is giving you a paycheck for your soul, which again is going to lead to fulfillment, which is the thing we ultimately want. A lot of times we put a lot of pressure on our paycheck, our actual physical paycheck, and promotions and architecture and cars and stuff to bring the fulfillment. But obviously that type of fulfillment never lasts. And so from the spiritual perspective, the fulfillment that we seek always comes from the inside. So we cultivate it within with making those daily choices, and making the commitment to do the thing that feels aligned is one of the fastest ways to get fulfilled inside. But you have to treat it seriously. You have to show up for it like a professional. As my friend, author Stephen Pressfield says, the difference in an amateur and professional is the amateur shows up when they feel like it, and the professional shows up because it's time to show up. That's the way I'm approaching this. That's the way I encourage you to approach your purpose-centric projects, to show up for it on a regular basis and to give yourself that deadline. So what I'm committing to you is every Monday, every Thursday, you will be getting a new spiritual perspective episode from me. And whatever else I got going on is just going to have to wait, or I'm going to have to just figure it out. But I'm pretty confident that I can make that happen because, again, I've been doing this on a weekly basis for 5 years now. And so this will just be a different expression of this podcast. And if you have any suggestions for how I can make it better, how I can make it even more impactful, I'm all ears. I love getting your feedback, and I want to feel like we're doing this together, right? Because I do get a lot of inspiration from hearing your comments and getting your questions. And I definitely view this as a community effort. So thank you in advance for your contributions and for staying engaged with me as I create all this stuff for you and for myself, and looking forward to this next chapter. So thank you all very much. And we'll see you next week with 2 spiritual perspective episodes. Take care. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you resonated with this solo episode and you want more, start by checking out this one. And otherwise, we've got an entire playlist of solo episodes on the channel. So make sure you're subscribed and please leave a comment letting me know which other topics you'd like for me to cover on this channel.